Our family's roots reach deep into the rocky soil of Donegal, Ireland. Donegal occupies the northwest corner of Ireland. It is similar in area to the U.S. state of Delaware. It is bounded by the Atlantic Ocean on the west and north, and 3 Northern Ireland counties on its east and south. It is isolated from the rest of the Irish Republic, connected only by the few miles which border County Leitrim. Its remoteness and stark, wild landscape, its terrible beauty, has always set Donegal apart from other destinations in Ireland. Our ancestors came from a section of Donegal known as the Rosses. The Rosses is situated on the Atlantic coast in the northwest section of the county. The coast is marked by spectacular sandy beaches and rocky cliffs. One rocky promontory is known as Spanish Rock, because tradition has it that in 1588, the mighty Spanish Armada was shipwrecked there. It is believed that some of the surviving sailors came ashore and eventually intermarried with the locals, perhaps contributing to the many black Irish in Donegal who have dark hair and blue eyes. The Rosses is a Gaeltacht region, where historically Gaelic was the native language and survived notwithstanding persistent efforts by the English to suppress it. Gaelic was once spoken throughout all of Ireland, but was grudgingly displaced by English, which became the dominant language in Ireland. Oscar Wilde, who had something to say on just about everything, proposed this remedy for the rancor over language. If one could only teach the English how to talk and the Irish how to listen, society here would be quite civilized. Gaelic is a very old language dating back to the 4th century in its earliest form. But even today, many in the Rosses can still speak or at least understand the ancient Irish tongue. Growing up, we sometimes heard Mom and Dad speaking Gaelic, and also our Aunts Hannah and Mary. One Gaelic expression we often heard Mom and Dad say to one another was, "Tan for bega geistja." We didn't understand it, of course, but soon noticed that it always preceded them clamming up or abruptly changing the subject. It seemed to be some kind of warning from one parent to the other that a little eavesdropper was listening. And sure enough, it means the little man is listening. Within the Rosses, Kincasla and Anagra are 2 small towns and parishes, each with its own church and cemetery, where many of our ancestors lie buried. The 2 villages are about 3 miles apart, along a road now known as R529 that connects them. If you proceed south on this road about 5 miles, you come to Dunlow, and going north through Gweedore, Filcara is about 10 miles away. The far larger town of Letterkenny is about 30 miles from Anagra. While our forebears certainly visited these market towns on fair days or other special occasions, their daily lives were spent mainly within the 6 or so square miles surrounding their home villages of Kincasla and Anagra. This close proximity and the common Gaelic language bred a sense of closeness and unity among our ancestors, which is a hallmark of all people from the Rosses, then and now. Although our parents, Edward O'Donnell from Anagra and Sheila Boyle from the Ballymanus neighborhood within Kincasla, were raised only a few miles apart, they did not know each other before coming to America. Growing up, however, our father had heard of the athletic achievements of Mom's uncles, which likely would have been reported in the local newspapers. And he also remembered seeing Mom's younger sister Mary in a play at the Ancestral Hall entitled The Auction at Kilbuck. He said she was very funny in the play, and though he surely didn't know at the time she was destined to become his sister-in-law. Good thing he didn't trash her performance. So it was in America that Mom and Dad met for the first time, after each had emigrated separately in 1929. At that time, people from the Rosses leaving for America would board the train at Crawley, and on departure days, the small station platform would be crowded with the young emigrants in their very best clothes, along with family and friends who had come to see them off. The train would then make its way from Crawley to Londonderry, where a steamship of the Anchor Line awaited. Third-class passage to New York one way cost $100, which in today's dollars would be about $1,500. In Londonderry, once all were on board, the ship would slip away from the dock and sail down Lough Foyle before entering the North Atlantic, and then turn left, bound for America. It was a time of mixed emotions. Excitement, certainly, about a new life in America, but also terrible sadness as the rocky coast of Donegal faded from view, because they did not know if or when they might ever see their parents or family again. Mom arrived in New York on April 3, 1929, aboard the SS Cameronia. She had been on board with some friends and then went to live with a cousin's family in Bayonne. Less than 2 months later, in May 1929, Dad arrived in New York along with his teenage sister Mary aboard the SS California. They were met at the dock by their oldest sister Hannah, who had preceded them in America 6 years earlier. It was at a wedding in Bayonne, New Jersey, that Mom and Dad met for the very first time. They began seeing each other, as the saying goes, and a romance blossomed. And on March 4th, 1939, in Jersey City, at the beautiful St. Aloysius Church, they were married. They settled in nearby Staten Island, and over the next quarter century proceeded to raise a family of 4 children. A wedding such as theirs between an O'Donnell and a Boyle would have been commonplace in the Rosses, as these 2 surnames are shared by many unrelated families, as is true of other common surnames in the Rosses, such as Duffy, Gallagher, Sweeney, and Dugan. The repetition of surnames led the locals long ago to adopt a naming convention that allowed them to distinguish one individual from another without reference to a last name. A person is known by his or her first name, combined with the first name of one parent. Thus, Dad was known locally as Ned Heala, with his mother's Sheila's name appended to his. To Mom's name was added the familiar form of her mother, Catherine's name, so that she became Sheila Cassie. The choice of a person's first name also followed a fairly uniform protocol. A father had the right to name a firstborn child after his own mother or father, as the case may be. The mother then had the same right for the second child. The third reverted back to the father, and the fourth to the mother. This alternating process proceeded through the whole set of children. Once the child's grandparents' names were exhausted, which often happened in the large families of the Rosses, the baby's uncles and aunts were enlisted for this purpose. Our family is a textbook example of this naming protocol. The firstborn, our sister Sheila, was named after Dad's mother. Mom then took her turn in naming the second child, James, for her father. When another boy came along, he got Dad's father's name of Edward. When the last of the 4 children arrived and turned out to be a boy, Mom had already used her father, and so turned to her oldest brother, Dan, for his name. On the other hand, had Danny turned out to be a girl, there would have been a baby sister in the family named Catherine. Our grandparents came from 4 families in the Rosses: Duffy, O'Donnell, and 2 different Boyle families. Dad's mother, our grandmother, was a Duffy. Her father, Big Ned Duffy, was born in 1851. Both he and his slightly older brother, John, came to the United States not long after the Civil War. They were part of a huge wave of Irish immigrants who came to America during and after the potato famine. Ned settled in Pennsylvania, where an attractive young lass named Nellie Sharkey caught his eye. He courted her and won her heart. And in December 1874, they were married at St. Bernard Church in Easton, Pennsylvania. She, too, was born in Ireland, and not long after their marriage, they returned to Donegal. Big Ned's parents did not know their son had married in America. He couldn't write and tell them because neither he nor they could read or write. But when he arrived home, he was a bit sly and did not at first let on that the pretty dark-haired girl with him was his wife. They were overjoyed to have their big strapping Ned home. The neighbors were invited in, the fiddle was tuned, songs were sung, and drink flowed freely. It was a grand celebration. But as the night wore on, his mother took Ned aside and whispered, "It's getting late. Shouldn't you be taking the young girl home now?" To which Ned declared, "She is home." And that's how they learned they had a daughter-in-law. Big Ned and Nellie lived out the rest of their lives in the Rosses. They had 9 children, 5 daughters and 4 sons. One of their daughters, Sheila, became Dad's mother and our grandmother. 5 of Dad's Duffy aunts and uncles followed in their parents' footsteps and came to America. Anne was the first to come. Like many others in Donegal, she went to County Tyrone in the north of Ireland to work on a farm. But instead of returning home in the winter of 1901-1902 as expected, Anne remained and saved enough of her extra savings to book passage in the spring. She apparently decided on her own to go to America. No one in Donegal even knew of her plans until after she had arrived in New York in April 1902. She was very brave to make the trip all by herself at the age of 22, without any relatives already established there. In America, she worked at several large estates in Bedford Hills, Locust Valley, and Greenwich, Connecticut. In those days, many wealthy bankers and businessmen lived on opulent estates and employed large staffs of help to maintain the house and grounds. Anne started as a maid, but soon worked her way up to the kitchen, where she was a quick study and became a truly remarkable cook. She was totally unfazed by the most demanding and challenging of recipes. In 1920, when she was 40, she married a French widower named Charlie Wilman, who was the gardener and caretaker on the same estate. Charlie had 2 young children, Anita and Paul, who Auntie Annie adopted and raised as her own. When Anita was 20, she fell in love with Cormac Breslin, a dashing young Donegal man who worked on the estate. She eloped with him to Ireland, where they were married. Together they raised a big family and launched Cormac's political career in 1937, when he was first elected to represent Donegal in the Irish Parliament. Cormac was re-elected in every election for the next 40 years, and he rose to great prominence as Céan Cathair of the Dáil, which is equivalent to the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, a position he held from 1967 to 1973. After Auntie Annie and her husband retired, they purchased a house in Portchester, New York, where she welcomed family with lavish meals. Jimmy, Eddie, and Sheila have fond childhood memories of visiting her there. Auntie Annie was the closest we ever came to knowing what it might be like to have a grandmother, a warm and friendly old lady who seemed delighted to see us, and a wonderful cook who specialized or so it seemed to us, in lemon chiffon and lemon meringue pies. Auntie Annie lived in America for 50 years. She made several trips back to Ireland. But a few years after her husband died, she returned for good in 1953. She moved into her bachelor brother Peter's house in Anagra. It is said that the butcher in Anagra would let out a sigh when he saw her coming into his shop. She was very demanding as to the cut of meats she wanted, and she was not about to lower her high culinary standards. Owey was the next Duffy to come to America. He came twice to the U.S. The first time was in 1910, when he stayed for 3 years and went out west. He then returned to Anagra for a decade to regale Dad's rising generation with tales about the wilds and wonders of the American West in Colorado, which he pronounced Colorado. In 1918, he married and started a family before emigrating once again in 1922 to manage the estate of a prominent doctor in Bedford Hills, New York. Owey had returned to America with the intention that his wife and young family would eventually join him there. When that did not happen, possibly because of the stock market crash and ensuing depression, he returned to Ireland once and for all in 1930. The youngest daughter of the Duffy family, Mary, came to the U.S. in 1923 and stayed for 5 years. Traveling with her to America was Dad's older sister, Hannah, who was only 17. It is unlikely that Hannah would have been permitted to emigrate so young were it not for the fact that she was traveling with her aunt. For much of Mary Duffy's time in the U.S., she was employed as a lady's maid in Dobbs Ferry, New York. When Mary returned to Ireland, she married John O'Donnell and opened a thriving grocery shop in Anagra. They had one son, Anthony, and the shop eventually passed on to him. He expanded it and launched several other related businesses and became a successful entrepreneur who we knew as Big Anthony. And Hannah's O'Connor children and grandchildren visited him in 1982. Dad's uncles, Peter and Patty, were lifelong bachelors. Patty was the youngest of the Duffy children, and he came to the U.S. in 1923. He was a bit of a character. He believed that a man's weight was a sign of strength and good health, and he loved to jump on the penny scales in the New York subway to prove how many stone weight he was. He liked to keep his weight up above 200 pounds, which was probably not a good idea because he wasn't very tall. He lived and worked in and around New York and Connecticut. He died of a heart attack in the U.S. when he was 56. His body was eventually brought back to be reinterred among the Duffys in Anagra's church cemetery. Uncle Peter first came to the U.S. in 1911. He headed out west to Butte, Montana to work in the mines. Butte was so rich in copper that it was nicknamed the richest hill on earth. So many Irish came to work there that by 1900, Butte had the largest percentage of Irish of any city in America. Peter later moved back east and worked in and around New York, where he was a mentor to our father. Dad and Uncle Peter worked together as sandhogs on a number of New York tunnel construction projects. They also roomed together for a time at a boarding house in Manhattan run by a Mrs. Olson, with whom many Irishmen stayed. Uncle Peter left America in 1932 and returned to Ireland, but he came back to visit several times, so that growing up we got to know him. Once back in Ireland, Peter opened a pub in Anagra known to the locals as Duffy's. He also built a lovely 2-story house in Anagra, which he later shared with his widowed sister, Anne. Of the remaining 4 Duffy siblings, Dad's mother Sheila, his Aunt Ellen, and Uncle John Duffy all stayed in Donegal to marry and raise families there. His Aunt Hannah Duffy married and raised 3 sons in Glasgow, Scotland, but returned often to Anagra. John Duffy was strikingly handsome. Sadly, he died young at age 46 of spinal cancer. In December 1929, from Letterkenny Hospital, he wrote to his brother Owey in America. My dear brother, in answer to your most welcome letter and money which I got here yesterday from home, I can never be half thankful to you for doing so much for me. I never dreamt you would do the like of that. You had plenty done before. I suppose I'll never be able to pay you back. If God will spare me, the health, and the family be any good, you will get a part of it. Well, Owey, I suppose you are all sorry to hear of my trouble and that I was in here. It's terrible to think now I'd be left powerless, but we must be thankful to whatever God has meant for us. Thank God this year is near an end. I'll never forget it. If anybody has put in his penance, I have done it. No wonder there's nothing left now but the bones. If you saw me now, I'm sure you would cry your fill. I was fine this time last year, but I suppose I'll never be the same again. But God is strong, and if I got the power in my bones, I might pick up this time. If my back got all right, I would pull through by degrees. I'm glad everybody is well over there and that Ned Sissy is doing so well. He would be very sorry for me. He was good company for you all year. I hope that Paddy got a new job since. I expect that he will be as stout as ever. I was glad Anne got across safe. I hope they will be lucky to fall into a good place. I am glad Peter is fine. I hope God will spare us all the health and bring us back to happiness this incoming year. This is an awful place to spend Xmas and the New Year, but I expect I won't be kept very long in here now. The doctor told me I would have to walk around a little if I could. They won't keep a person too long here with my complaint. I'm getting no medicine now anyhow, so I would be better at home if I could manage. I will write again and let you know if I'm improving, so I must finish now. I hope you all enjoyed a Merry Xmas and a Happy New Year, and many more may you all. I hope it won't be in bed. I'll write you the next letter. I remain as ever, Owey, your loving brother, Johnny. He died a few weeks later, leaving behind a wife and 7 fine-looking children. Big Ned Duffy, his father, was a pallbearer when they laid him to rest in Anagra Cemetery. Dad's mom, Sheila, was a still youthful 47 when Dad and Aunt Mary left for America in 1929. But she died just 7 years later, so he never saw her again. And Hannah was more fortunate, returning to Ireland for a visit in 1932, when both parents were still alive. When Dad finally returned to Ireland for the first time in 1948, one of the first things he and his father did together during that otherwise joyful reunion was to visit his mother's grave. Dad brought back a stone from her grave to serve as a perpetual reminder of the love they shared. The tales of America and its opportunities that Dad's generation heard from their Duffy grandparents, aunts, and uncles had an impact. In addition to Dad and his sisters Hannah and Mary, 7 of their 12 Duffy cousins came to America. They settled into Irish enclaves in and around New York City and remained in close contact. And though their deep and abiding love for the old country never wavered, they chose to stay and launch the first generation of Irish Americans. Mom's mother was one of the Boyles of Bunnaman. Bunnaman is a neighborhood within Anagra. When he was just 19, her father, our great-grandfather, Dan Boyle, known locally as Donald Frank, married his bride, Mary Boyle, in 1872 at St. Mary's Church in Kincasla. St. Mary's is a lovely church which sits charmingly by the sea. It was built in 1856. All of our great-grandparents, except the Duffys, were married here. Like many churches of its time, St. Mary's is built in the shape of a cross and includes a cemetery where loved ones are buried. In those days, old and young in the Rosses would walk several miles to get to Mass, and they also would have been fasting from midnight to receive communion. It was a hardship, but they had strong faith. The church in Anagra was eventually built in 1895 and eased some of the journey to Mass. The marriage of Dan and Mary Boyle was a good one. They settled in Bunnaman and had 10 children, 6 sons and 4 daughters. Son Francis was the oldest. He was followed at 2-year intervals by John and then Cassie, who was Mom's mother and our grandmother. There was a 22-year age difference between the oldest and the youngest, Gracie. The 1901 Irish census records reveal that Dan and Mary still had 7 of their 10 children at home with them in Bunnaman. But sadly, thereafter, 2 of their children died young. Anthony in 1904 when he was 22, and Maggie in 1906 when she was only 16. They are buried in the family plot in Kincasla Cemetery. Mom's Uncle Francis was a sergeant in the Royal Irish Constabulary, or RIC. The RIC was the police force in Ireland when the country was part of the United Kingdom. Unlike police elsewhere in the United Kingdom, RIC constables were routinely armed, including with rifles, and billeted in barracks, and the force had a militaristic structure. While he was stationed in County Cavan, Francis met and married a local girl named Mary Daly. Shortly thereafter, Francis was reassigned and they moved to Belfast. In 1912, Mary died, leaving Francis with 4 very young children to raise. He married another Mary, Mary McGrath, who lived next door, and they had 1 child together. When Francis died, his second wife Mary emigrated in 1925 with the youngest 2 children, leaving Belfast for Toronto, Canada, where her sister was living. There, she established the foothold that would later draw her oldest stepson, Jack, to Toronto, along with Mom's Uncle Fergal and his family in 1928. John, Charles, Fergal, and Owen Boyle were wonderful athletes. They were widely known throughout the Rosses and beyond as the athletic Boyle brothers of Bunnaman. John Boyle was a terrific athlete, probably the best of the 4 brothers. Growing up, he had no equal in the Rosses at track and field events. He emigrated to Scotland and soon gained prominence there for his athletic ability. He won many track and field events throughout Scotland. In 1900, he took first prize in the 220-yard dash at Power Hall, Glasgow. Scottish sports writers marked him down as a true champion in the making. To give you an idea of how good and versatile he was, at the 1904 Olympics in St. Louis, the gold medal in the high jump was won at 5 feet 11 inches. But just 3 years earlier, John had beat all comers in Edinburgh in the same event, clearing 5 feet 9 inches. His 1901 win at Motherwell, Scotland for the triple jump at 47 feet was just 2 feet shy of what would win the gold at the 1904 Olympics. John Boyle was a potential world beater, and with proper coaching and training, he might very well have been an Olympic gold medalist in at least 2 events. John married Kate McHale from Mayo, and they had 2 sons. He was a constable with the RIC stationed in County Kerry. In later years, they moved to Stamford, England, and that is where he died in 1958 at the age of 83. Charles Boyle was 4 years younger than John, and his athletic career peaked in 1907-1908 when at the Games at Haddington, Scotland, he won both the triple jump and the long jump. And at Burton Port, where he cleared 5 feet 11 inches in the high jump, which was the same height that had won the gold at the Olympic Games just 3 years earlier in St. Louis. It was no mean feat for an unknown Rosses man to come within striking distance of the world's best. Charles married and raised 7 children in the family homestead in Bunnaman, which we visited on our trip to Ireland in 2015. Like his older brothers, Francis and John, Mom's uncle Fergal joined the Royal Irish Constabulary when he was 21 in 1912. But during World War I, both he and his brother Owen Boyle were sergeants in the Irish Guards Regiment of the British Army. At the Guards sports competition in 1917, Fergal won first prize in a 5-mile cross-country race run at Epsom, England. In that same year, competing at Tidworth, England, Owen won the long jump competition. A still greater achievement came later that year at Brentwood, England. Competing against the flower of the British Army, the 2 brothers, Fergal and Owen, were first and second, respectively, in a cross-country race of 7 miles. Matched against 600 other competitors, Mom's 2 uncles not only led the field, but enabled their team of 4 from the No. 1 company of the Irish Guards to take top honors that day. Thus, Owen and Fergal completed the quartet of brother athletes whom Dad had come to know of even before he met Mom as the Athletic Boyles of Bunnaman. Owen was sent to France during World War I and fought in the Battle of Somme. More than 3 million men fought in that battle, and 1 million were wounded or killed, making it one of the bloodiest battles in human history. Owen Boyle was one of the wounded, but fortunately he made a full recovery. After his time in the Army, Owen returned to the Rosses, where he married Sheila Dugan and raised a family of 9 children. Fergal Boyle married Elizabeth Fitzpatrick in London in 1924. She too was from Ireland, but they settled in England until 1928, when they, along with their 2-year-old daughter, emigrated to Canada. It may be that Fergal could not have comfortably returned to live in Ireland because of his former service in the Royal Irish Constabulary. After the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which ended the War for Irish Independence, was signed, and the Irish Free State was established in 1922, the RIC was disbanded and Ireland established its own Civic Guard police force. But some Irish who had formerly served in the RIC were subjected to threats of violent reprisals, and they emigrated with their families. It's unclear how well Mom would have known her Uncle Fergal growing up, as she was only 7 years old when he left to join the RIC. But she and Dad stayed in touch with him in Canada over the years. In 1965, they drove to visit him in Toronto, when Fergal was 74, and the last surviving of the Boyle brothers. Mary Boyle married a James O'Donnell when she was 30. Like Mom and Dad, it was an O'Donnell-Boyle marriage. They had no children but reared Mary's niece, called Wee Mary, who was the daughter of her sister Gracie. Mary and her husband James are buried together in the same Kincasla gravesite as Mom's parents, Cassie and Jimmy Jesse Boyle. Mom's Aunt Gracie was the youngest of the Boyles of Bunnaman. She was only 10 when Mom was born, and would have seemed a very youthful aunt to Mom growing up. At age 21, Gracie married Neil O'Donnell. There it is again, an O'Donnell-Boyle marriage. And together they raised a family of 8. Gracie's daughter, Kathleen, was born shortly before Mom left for America in 1929. Mom was asked to be godmother for the newborn Kathleen, which must have been a singular honor and a continuing link to the family that she was leaving behind. Sadly, one of Gracie's sons was killed in the Ballymanus mine disaster. It was May 11, 1943. A black object appeared midday, bobbing just off the rocks near the White Strand. Word went out that something curious was afloat off Ballymanus. Young men and boys gathered to see what it was. 2 men fetched a rope. Maybe it could be dragged ashore. Not an easy task because it was large and round. As they worked at it, the crowd of onlookers swelled. Some, the lucky ones, got bored and went home to chores or supper. As the light faded and the hour approached 10 p.m., they finally got it ashore. In the dying light, it could now be touched and inspected. All of a sudden, there was a blinding flash and roar that shook every house in the Rosses and was heard 30 miles away in Letterkenny. In some nearby homes, the mantel clock stopped at the exact moment of the explosion. 19 young men and boys were killed. Among them was Gracie's 16-year-old son, Manus O'Donnell. For the small, tight-knit community, loss of life on this scale was unimaginable and devastating. No family was left untouched, and they bore the scars of it to the end of their days, including Aunt Gracie. Several memorials dot the shore near the scene of the disaster, as a reminder to this day of the tragedy. The memorial in nearby Duff bears this inscription: Though it happened at the height of the Battle of the Atlantic in World War II, it is thought that it was a mine that was left over from World War I, which had broken loose and floated down from the Royal Navy anchorage in the North Sea. So it was that an object designed to sink a battleship arrived off the Donegal coast years after World War I had ended and killed so many who weren't even involved in the war. Mom's mother, Cassie Boyle, was the third of her parents' 10 children, and the oldest of 4 daughters. Born in 1877, she was almost 20 when she married another Boyle, Jimmy Jesse, in 1896, and settled down to raise her own family in nearby Ballymanus. Cassie was a farmer's wife and mother of 6 children. Margaret, who we knew as Aunt Maggie, was the first of the children, followed by Uncle Dan and then Mom. After Mom came brothers and our uncles Anthony and Manus, and their baby sister, our Aunt Mary. Cassie was 52 when Mom left for America at age 25 in 1929. Along with her husband, Jimmy Jesse, she lived her life in the same general neighborhood where she was born and raised until she died at the age of 72. One winter's day in 1949, a week or so before Christmas, Jimmy and Sheila still remember coming home from Sacred Heart School to find Mom sitting tearful at the kitchen table. The pages of a letter spread out before her. They contained the news that her mother had died. Mom never did see her again after that March day when she left Ballymanus 20 years earlier to come to America. Such was the painful cost of emigration.
husband is dead.
God rest his soul.
My son is the O'Donnell now. Hugh has succeeded Hugh.
The hour has struck, Lady Ineen. Do we strike too?
Do we fight for Ireland?
The O'Donnells can do nothing by ourselves. No single clan is strong enough. Only if all the clans unite, the McSweeneys, the Maguires, the O'Neills, O'Connors, every one of us, can we stand up to the English.
And fight?
No, bargain from strength.
Bargain? For what?
To be left alone and free, not occupied by English troops. To protect our coastline with our own men.
I say face the English with an army. Fight them before they occupy us. Show them.
How would that help Ireland? By laying waste our lands?
The legend, Hugh, the legend. That Ireland shall be free.
If I can make all the clans unite, with an army behind me, the English will listen. They want no war with us, nor we with them.
In the 15th century, Ireland was supposedly governed by the English crown, but the reality was that only a small part, known as the Pale, was under the control of the king and English law. Beyond the Pale, the country was ruled by Irish chieftains. And Tyrconnell, which included all of present-day Donegal, as well as parts of Sligo, Leitrim, Tyrone, Fermanagh, and Derry, was firmly under the control of the O'Donnells. Red Hugh O'Donnell was the great chieftain who ruled as Lord of Tyrconnell from his castle in Donegal town. Red Hugh had a prolonged fight against the English. He led his army with notable victories, like at the Battle of Curlew Pass, where the English were ambushed and routed. But ultimately, in 1601, after marching 250 miles, he and his army were defeated by the English at the Battle of Kinsale. Red Hugh died vainly seeking support from Spain in 1602. O'Donnell control of Donegal ended with the flight of the Earls, when Red Hugh's successor and supporters left Ireland in 1607 for exile in Europe, rather than submit to English domination. In 2007, a monument by the Irish sculptor John Behan, commemorating the flight of the Earls, was unveiled near the pier in Rathmullen, Donegal, from which they departed. It depicts three cloaked figures, symbolizing the three Gaelic chieftains O'Donnell, O'Neill, and Maguire, bidding farewell to their people. And the kneeling figure is meant to represent Donegal in particular, where O'Donnell's mighty castle would all too soon fall into English hands. The flight of the Earls ended 1,000 years of Celtic rule in Ulster, and had a profound impact upon the course of Irish history. On our family trip in 2015, we visited the O'Donnell Castle in Donegal town.
Ed insisted on paying for everyone.
It's my treat. I think last time we were here, Danny treated. So. 2007 was the 400th anniversary of the flight of the Earls, which is when the O'Donnells, Red Hugh's successor Rory, and the other Earls who had been defeated by the English left for exile in Europe rather than submit to the English. So in 2007 was the 400th anniversary. Phil Coulter he composed a song called If These Stones Could Speak. And it was basically reimagining how the ghost of Red Hugh might remember and appreciate that the longer in the hands of the English. And they had a great concert here. And the song that he composed was played. And it was a wonderful recognition, commemoration of the castle, and that it's now in Irish hands. This is all restored.
Our great-grandfather was Owen O'Donnell, and he married Nora Gallagher. Nora was born and raised on Owey Island. Owey is one of several islands off the Ross's coast. It is 300 acres in size, and there were less than 100 living on the island at the time of our great-grandmother Nora's birth in the 1830s. The inhabitants built their houses on the south side of the island because it is less rocky and more accessible by boat, and because it offers protection from the stormy gales of the North Atlantic. The geography of the island and views of the mainland are absolutely stunning. Owey has inspired several Irish artists. Owey Islanders were a hardy breed. They coexisted with and took sustenance from the surrounding sea, catching fish and growing produce with fertilizer made from seaweed. Everything, including cattle and sheep, had to cross over to the island by boat. So Owey men had to be expert boatmen in their small boats called curras, which navigated the waters around the island. There was a post office on the island, and if someone were coming to visit, they would write to advise of their intended visit. Each Owey family had a designated stone or spot on the beach on the mainland. The visitor would stand precisely on that spot, and upon seeing them from the island, a family member would row over in the curragh to collect them. And if you stood on the wrong spot or rock, well, apologies would be in order to the wrong family who had come to fetch you. There was turf on the island, which they used for cooking and to heat their homes, and to brew poitín. Nora's brothers were said to be excellent poitín makers. There was no school on the island when Nora was growing up, but one was opened in 1911. Then, as they did elsewhere in the Rosses, The Owey children were expected to bring one piece of turf with them to keep the schoolroom warm during their lessons. There was no church or cemetery on the island, so when a loved one died, their coffin had to be loaded into the curragh for a final voyage to the church and graveyard in Kincastle. Jack P. Yeats, the brother of poet William Butler Yeats, was a painter, and he chose this subject matter for his painting, An Island Funeral. Although they were separated from the mainland, they did not live in total isolation. People young and old would meet at the social and religious occasions, which brought them in from over the sea. And many Owey Islanders, like our great-grandmother Nora, intermarried with other Ross's families. There is no electricity or running water on the island, and there have been no permanent residents living on Owey since 1974. But people still visit, and some even have summer homes on the island. And Owey has become an extremely popular destination for kayaking, rock climbing, and exploring the many caves on the island. Nora left life on Owey and moved to Anagra when she married Owen O'Donnell in 1860. Nora and Owen had 7 children, 4 boys and 3 girls. Dad's father, our grandfather, Neddy, was the youngest. Dad's O'Donnell aunts and uncles lived out their lives in the Rosses. All but one married. Barney was the exception. Dad recalled hearing that his Aunt Ellen on the Duffy side once had a big crush on his Uncle Barney, who was a fine-looking man, but quite content to remain a bachelor. The other 5 O'Donnell aunts and uncles married and had children. Dad and his siblings had 25 cousins on the O'Donnell side. They were spread across 4 different family names: Campbell, Brennan, and Gallagher, as well as O'Donnell. Aunt Mary O'Donnell married Donnie Campbell. They settled in Nunlow and had 6 children. His Aunt Nancy married Hugh Brennan, and she too moved to Dunlow, where they had 5 children. Dad's Aunt Betty married Charlie Gallagher and raised 6 children in Anagra. They lived in a nice house across from the church where Dad and other young fellows would gather at night to play card games. Uncle Johnny O'Donnell and his wife Sally Duffy also remained in Anagra, where they raised 7 children. One of them, Patty Johnny, was Dad's inseparable boyhood friend. Dad's Uncle Paddy lived in the O'Donnell family homestead. He married Mary Gillespie, and they had 1 daughter. By the time Dad made his first trip back to Ireland in 1948, all of his O'Donnell aunts and uncles had died. The one remaining child from that family was Dad's own father, Neddy Owen. Neddy Owen married Sheila Duffy, and they raised their family in a house on a hill overlooking Anagra. From their front yard you could see the church and town below. They had 7 children, 2 boys and 5 girls. The first and oldest was our Aunt Hannah, followed by Dad, and then Aunt Mary. Next came our Aunts Ellen and Betty, and then the 2 youngest, Auntie Anne and the baby of the family, our Uncle John. Uncle John was just 10 when Dad and Aunt Mary left for America in 1929. Neddy Owen was a farmer and lived his entire life in Anagra, though he would sometimes travel to Scotland or County Tyrone to work in the fields during harvest season to earn money for the family. Dad made his first trip back to Ireland in 1948. His mother had died in 1936, but his father was still hale and hearty at 72. It was a great homecoming. His father was living in the family home with Dad's married sister, Ellen, and her family. His sisters, Betty and Anne, and brother John, all came from Scotland for a joyful reunion with their much-missed brother, Ned. Dad always cherished the memory of this return to Ireland for the precious time he was able to spend with his father. No fewer than 6 of our generation were named after Neddy Owen. There was Eddie O'Connor, Aunt Hannah's son, Eddie O'Donnell, Dad's son, Eddie Sweeney, Aunt Mary's son, Eddie Gallagher, Auntie Ellen's son, Eddie Gilday, Auntie Anne's son, and Eddie O'Donnell, Uncle John's son. Neddy Owen died in 1957 at age 81, and he is buried in Anagra Church Cemetery, along with his wife, Sheila. This branch of our family is named for Mom's paternal grandmother, Jessie O'Donnell. Jessie was born in 1844 and became a Boyle when at age 20 she married Dan Boyle. The family took her first name as an identifier, so they were known locally as the Jessie Boyles. The women in Jessie's family were blessed with good looks. Jessie once won a beauty contest in Letterkenny, and her younger sister, Anne, was a beautiful redhead who caught the eye of the master of the small schoolhouse in Broad, which is just down the road from Ballymanus. They married and left Donegal for Australia. In those days, travel to Australia was quite an undertaking. 2 months or more at sea with often turbulent and stormy seas. Jessie's brother Hugh also went to Australia, where he opened the Star Hotel in Sydney, which is still there today, but in what has since become Sydney's Chinatown. Jessie's father was one of the largest tenant farmers in Ballymanus, and was reputed to have owned it all at one time or another. Her brother Sean and his wife Sarah owned a successful pub in Mulladuff, which is still there today, but now known as Boners. Jessie and Dan Boyle had 9 children, 3 boys and 6 girls. Jimmy Jessie, Mom's father and our grandfather, was born in 1871. He was the second of the 3 boys. Brother Doney was a year older, and Manus 15 years younger. His older sister Biddy was close to him in age. Jimmy Jessie also had 4 younger sisters, Anne, Sheila, Mary, and Sarah. In 2015, with our cousins Mary and Anne, we viewed what remains of the house where the Jessie Boyles grew up in Brage. The Jessie Boyle's house was just a stone's throw away from the White Strand, a spectacularly beautiful beach, which remarkably today has something right next to it, which most definitely was not around or ever imagined in Dan and Jessie Boyle's time. An airport. What? Because of its location, Donegal Airport has several times been chosen as the most scenic airport in the world. We flew out of it to Dublin at the end of our 2015 trip. Growing up, Mom was surrounded by Jessie aunts and uncles and lots of cousins. She had 53 first cousins on the Jessie side, which means today we likely have more than 150 second cousins on our Jessie side. Jimmy Jessie's sister, Biddy, had 8 children with Aunt and Sharky, 3 boys and 5 girls. Mary Jessie had 10 children with husband Maurice Green. Mary Jessie was Mom's godmother, and after coming to America, Mom would send her $5 every year at Christmas. This relationship was clearly a special one to Mom, and even after Mary Jessie died, Mom continued to send the money to Mary's granddaughter, Josephine Green. Anne Jessie was named for Jessie's sister Anne, who went to Australia. Her aunt sent money to her niece and namesake to come and join her in Australia, but Anne Jessie declined and remained in Donegal, where she married Brian Harley. She not only raised 12 children of her own, but she took in and raised the orphaned daughter of a neighbor as well. She also acted as a midwife, helping deliver babies in the local area. It was said that her house was never empty. It was a gathering place for the young people in the neighborhood. Sheila Jessie married Neil Rogers and had 9 children. Mom visited her in the 1970s when she was in her 90s and the last surviving of her Jessie aunts and uncles. Sheila Jessie lived to be 101. Sarah, the youngest of the Jessie sisters, married Neil Gallagher, and they had 10 children. Sadly, 3 of their children died young. Sarah is buried in Anagra Church Cemetery. Jimmy Jessie's younger brother, Manus, married Bridget O'Donnell. They had 4 children and lived in Edinburgh, Scotland. Older brother, Donny, never married. He worked on farms in Scotland. When he returned to Ireland, he lived in Ballymanus with Jimmy Jessie and his wife, Cassie. He suffered a stroke in later years. Our Aunt Maggie and Uncle Manus cared for him until his death. He is buried with the Jessie Boyles in Kincasla Cemetery. Mom's grandparents, Jessie and Dan, also endured the loss of a newborn infant daughter, Margaret, in 1879. There was no time to have her baptized, and in keeping with the custom of the time, she was buried in unconsecrated ground on an island off Carrickfinn called, in Gaelic, Oileán na Marbite, which means the Island of the Dead. Margaret is buried there, along with other children who had similarly died in what the Catholic Church then considered to be a spiritual state of limbo. All are in unmarked graves, save one. The one exception is Dan and Jessie's infant daughter, Margaret. Today, the local people have embraced these innocents. A Celtic cross has been erected on the island, and a service is conducted annually on the island in memory of all who are buried there. Anne Jessie's granddaughter, Kathleen Hanlon, and Kathleen's own daughter, Anne, appeared in a documentary about the island that was shown on Irish television.
A fágach gan éon sort buan chuoineáin a bheith déanta ortha. Is geall sort cúta bhtáisiúil leis na leanaí na hiarachtaí dentar nómh na honnaid seo a bhaisiú iad a achóirú placin na beag a chuir an arda.
Jesus, don't be tough. Let us get up first.
I think it's very sad that they couldn't be buried in the graves where their parents would be buried.
Just out here, folks. Kathy, we second. Okay.
I love going to it, and I love sitting up there just beside the grave.
Now the ground was blessed. They're on consecrated ground. It's sort of taken them back into the community, and it's remembering, maybe not by name, but remembering that there is angels and babies buried there. They did exist. They were born, and they were ours. Although there's only one grave on the island that is named, there's hundreds of babies buried there. And I suppose by having that grave to go to, people will stand at our grave and they'll pray, but they're praying for everybody that's on that island. And it's bringing it home, and it's bringing a community together, and it's putting back that there's no sin, there's no shame. They were innocent babies, they were angels, and they were our angels and our children.
Ar na there now gani for Daniel to get a can to the holler Talaman here now, gnarly all to do. Guys, he's now to shed of Owey at land the rest of the town, she and the lad the Spanish who are the rags, the Spanish tar the rainies.
Mom's father, our grandfather, Jimmy Jesse, married Cassie Boyle in 1896 when he was 25. He and Cassie raised their family of 3 boys and 3 girls in Ballymanus. Jimmy Jesse was primarily a farmer, but he was also a merchant. He had a horse and cart and would travel as far as Derry, some 70 miles away, to purchase goods that he would then resell. He had a stall at the monthly town fairs in the region and sold men and boys' clothing. In 1960, when Jimmy Jesse was 89, Mom returned to Ballymanus after more than 30 years away. She took Danny along with her. Danny has vivid memories of the 8 weeks he spent that summer in the Rosses. Oh, wow. That trip in 1960 was an unforgettable adventure for my 12-year-old self. We flew from New York on Aer Lingus, landing in the early morning at Shannon. Our plane was named St. Bridget. Dad joked that with so many nuns and priests on our flight, we were sure to arrive safely, and we did. I took this picture of Mom when we reboarded the St. Bridget for the short flight on to Dublin. In Dublin, Mom and I took the bus out to Phoenix Park and walked on busy O'Connell Street. I climbed to the top of Nelson's Pillar. From the top I could survey all of O'Connell Street below. Who knew that 6 years later it would be blown up by the IRA? Then we went to Cleary's department store to buy an Ireland patch for my scout leader, Mr. Powers. The next day we boarded a train at what was then called Amiens Street Station for the trip north. The train was pulled by a steam locomotive, which was a treat to see. We had our suitcases and I had all new clothes. Mom had taken me down to Archie Jacobson's, which was then the very best men and boys clothing store on Staten Island. I got completely outfitted, including, well, a fedora hat with a red feather. This was new for me. I had never had a hat like that. My father did, but he was an adult, and I don't think his had a feather. I was 12, but when I put it on, I looked like a little man who would maybe do your taxes. I wasn't too convinced that I would be able to bring this hat thing off. The plan was that I would have it on my head when I stepped onto the platform at Strabane, where our relatives would be waiting. When we were about 30 minutes away from Strabane, Mom said we should start to get ready. I took that to mean that I should put the hat with the feather on. I did, and I caught my reflection in the window and thought, maybe this will work out after all. I looked kind of normal, I think. I loved the train ride, and I was glued to the window, ogling the scenery. Mom got up to go to the restroom. I noticed the window could be lowered from the top, so I let the window down. Then there was something that attracted my attention, and I put my head out the window, and that hat blew off my head. I could see it rolling in the green fields as the train sped on. I was stricken. I thought, oh God, it's gone. Now what do I do? I was worried that Mom would be annoyed with me. I had lost the hat and its red feather before our relatives had even gotten a gander at it, and in such a stupid way. But when she came back and I told her what had happened, she thought it was hilarious. She laughed and said that someone will be working out in the field and find that grand hat and think it had a label inside. How the heck did this get here? All the way from Archie Jacobson's in Staten Island. I stepped onto the platform hatless. No hat and no feather. It caught no notice, and it did not detract from my reception one iota. But Mom and I often wondered who found that hat with the red feather. Mom was nervous as our train pulled into the station at Strabane. She had been away for 30 years. Uncle Dan and Aunt Maggie were waiting on the platform to meet us and take us to Ballymanus. Tears were shed. I remember hearing afterwards that it was out of character for Maggie to venture from the homestead, but she had been insistent that she wanted to be there. When we got to the house, the rest of the family was there. And of course, Jimmy Jesse, who was seated in his chair. I remember he shook my hand and said, "You are very welcome," and I felt special. I remember, too, that Mom embraced him and put her head down on his shoulder and stayed in that position for an extended period, and both of them cried. We watched them silently. Then we had a big, joyous party with laughter and music. Everyone was so happy. When it was pointed out to Mom that there was a wedding picture of her and Dad hanging prominently in the kitchen, Uncle Dan joked that they had just put it up, that it had been lying dusty under Jimmy Jesse's bed. They had to get the tongs, he said, to pull it out from under the bed and hang it up before Mom got there. There was a lot of new life in Ballymanus that summer. The cat had kittens, and a new calf was born, which thereafter was known as Danny's calf. I loved exploring the shore and coastline and the White Strand. Uncle Dan took me out fishing in the Curragh, and we sailed to Innisfree, a small island off the coast where we built a tower of rocks, which, if you knew where to look, you could see back on the mainland. Every Tuesday and Thursday in Ballymanus at lunchtime, this would be heard on the kitchen radio.
Fry Cadbury, makers of Cadbury's Dairy Milk Chocolate, present the Kennedys of Castle Ross. It's Thursday afternoon in the town of Castle Ross, and in her shop in Kevin Street, Mrs. Kennedy is talking to a customer who has just run.
Aunt Maggie was a faithful listener to the Kennedys of Castle Ross. I even started listening. I was all in that summer. Whatever they were doing, I was doing. Aunt Maggie Manus was an excellent baker. She made delicious rhubarb pies with perfect crusts sprinkled with sugar. There was a huge stack of turf next to Dad's house. You could climb on it and gather pieces for the fire. I met so many new aunts and uncles and cousins that summer. There were lots of parties, always with song and singing. And there were familiar faces, too. I remember Auntie Annie had us over to her house for a wonderful dinner. The meal was great, but she had nothing good to say about the Anagram butcher. Good thing for him there was no Yelp then. Mom enjoyed herself immensely that summer. My aunts knitted me a beautiful Irish sweater to take back to the States with me. But when we tried it on, a day or two before our departure, they hadn't quite anticipated the extent of my belly. Too many rhubarb pies, I guess. It had to be ripped out and redone. It seemed like all of Ballymanus was pressed into service to get it reknitted in time for our departure. And miraculously, they did. We were all sad when it was time to leave and return to the U.S. It had been a magical summer, which I will never forget. In old age, Jimmy Jesse was hard of hearing and often would not get a whit of what was being said to him. But he had perfected an all-purpose response. He would say, "Just so." Maybe not the most exciting of conversation, but when you think about it, it would fit, wouldn't it? Almost anything that someone might say to you. Jimmy Jesse is the only one of our grandparents that any of us met. Sheila, too, met him on her trip to Ireland in 1961. Jimmy Jesse was blessed with good health and length of years. In May 1967, he died in his bed at home in Ballymanus at the age of 96. He is buried in Kincastle Cemetery next to his beloved Cassie. Just so, Jimmy Jesse. Just so.